My grandmother's house was a trove of hidden treasures. Every nook and cranny contained a piece of history, an artifact of times long past. As a child, I spent countless hours exploring its dusty corners, uncovering old photo albums, tarnished jewelry, and other forgotten relics. But it was on my 10th birthday that I discovered something truly extraordinary and terrifying. We were in the attic, a space filled with cobwebs and the musty scent of old wood. I was helping my grandmother organize some boxes when I stumbled upon an ornate antique doll. Its porcelain face was pale and flawless, with glassy blue eyes that seemed almost too real. The doll wore a faded lacy dress and a bonnet adorned with delicate ribbons. My grandmother's face lit up when she saw what I had found. "Ah, Evangeline," she murmured, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "This doll has been in our family for generations. It belonged to your great-great-aunt Elizabeth." I was enchanted. The doll was beautiful, a perfect addition to my collection. My grandmother handed it to me with a smile. "Take good care of her," she said, her eyes twinkling. "She's very special." That night I placed Evangeline on a shelf in my room, arranging her amongst my other dolls. She stood out, her presence commanding and almost regal. I couldn't shake the feeling that those glassy eyes were watching me, but I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. The first incident happened a few nights later. I woke in the middle of the night to a soft whispering sound. At first I thought it was the wind or perhaps a dream, but as I listened I realized the whispering was coming from the shelf where Evangeline sat. I switched on the bedside lamp and gasped. The doll had moved. She was no longer facing forward but turned slightly, her head tilted as if she were listening. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was still half asleep. Dolls don't move on their own, I told myself. I got out of bed, repositioned Evangeline, and went back to sleep, though it took a while for my racing heart to calm. The next morning I asked my grandmother about the doll. "Did Evangeline ever move when you had her?" I ventured. My grandmother looked at me sharply, her expression suddenly serious. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound foolish. "I thought I saw her in a different position last night, and I heard whispering." My grandmother's face paled. She took my hand and led me to the kitchen. "There are things about Evangeline you need to know," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Elizabeth, your great-great-aunt, she died when she was very young. She was about your age. The doll was her favorite toy." I felt a chill run down my spine. "How did she die?" "It was a tragic accident," my grandmother replied. "She fell down the stairs while holding Evangeline. After her death, strange things started happening. My mother swore she could hear Elizabeth's voice at night, whispering secrets. The doll would move on its own, just as you described. Eventually, they locked it away in the attic, hoping the disturbances would stop." I stared at my grandmother, my heart pounding. "Do you think Elizabeth's spirit is in the doll?" She sighed heavily. "I don't know, dear. But it seems that way. Maybe she just wants to be remembered." That night I placed Evangeline back on the shelf, feeling a mix of fear and pity. "Elizabeth," I whispered, "if you're there, I hope you're at peace." For a while everything was quiet. The whispers stopped and the doll stayed in place. I started to relax, thinking perhaps Elizabeth had found some solace. But then the dreams began. In my dreams, I was in a grand old house, much like my grandmother's, but larger and more ornate. I would walk through the hallways, searching for something I couldn't quite name. And always I would hear the faint sound of a girl crying. The crying would lead me to a locked door at the top of a staircase, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't open it. One night, the dream changed. This time, the door was ajar, and I could hear the crying more clearly. I pushed the door open and found myself in a dusty, forgotten room. In the center of the room was a girl, her back to me, clutching Evangeline. She turned slowly, and I gasped. She had no face, just a smooth expanse of porcelain. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding in my chest. The clock read 3 a.m. I looked over at the shelf, and Evangeline was gone. Panic surged through me. I searched the room frantically and found her sitting in my rocking chair, her head tilted, her glassy eyes staring straight at me. "Elizabeth," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" The room grew cold, and I heard the whisper again, louder this time. "Remember me," it said. "Find me." The next morning, I told my grandmother everything. She listened with a grave expression, then nodded. "I think it's time we found out what happened to Elizabeth," she said. We spent the day searching through old family records, letters, and journals. We discovered that Elizabeth's death had been more than just a tragic accident. There were rumors of foul play, whispers of a jealous sibling who had pushed her down the stairs in a fit of rage. That night, we placed Evangeline in the center of the living room and lit candles around her. My grandmother held my hand as we called out to Elizabeth, asking her to show us the truth. The air grew cold, and the candles flickered. A soft, mournful wail filled the room, and the shadows seemed to dance. Suddenly, Evangeline's head turned towards us, and her eyes glowed with an eerie light. "Find me," the whisper came, louder and more urgent. The next day we searched the house again, this time with a sense of purpose. We discovered a hidden compartment under the staircase where Elizabeth had died. Inside, we found a bundle of letters and a small, tarnished locket. The letters revealed the truth. Elizabeth's sister had indeed pushed her, consumed by jealousy over their parents' affection for the younger girl. We held a small ceremony, placing the locket and letters in a box and burying them in the garden, hoping it would bring Elizabeth peace. That night the whispers stopped, and Evangeline remained still. I slept peacefully for the first time in weeks. Years have passed since those events. Evangeline still sits on my shelf, a silent guardian of our family's dark history. I sometimes hear a faint whisper on the wind, but it's no longer filled with sorrow. Instead, it feels like a gentle reminder, a promise that Elizabeth is finally at peace. But I will never forget those nights of terror, the feeling of being watched, and the knowledge that some spirits never truly rest until their stories are told. And as long as Evangeline remains with me, I will remember, and I will listen. I always thought of myself as a rational person, the kind who could dismiss ghost stories and urban legends with a laugh. But my perspective changed on that fateful night in the city park. My name is Alex, and this is the story of how a simple evening walk turned into a living nightmare. It was early October, and the crisp air had a bite to it that evening. The city park, usually bustling with joggers and families during the day, transformed into a quiet, almost eerie place at night. I decided to take a stroll to clear my mind after a long day at work. The park's towering trees, their leaves painted in shades of red and gold, whispered secrets to each other in the cool breeze. As I walked along the familiar paths, I noticed something odd. The plants seemed larger. Bushes that I remembered being waist-high now towered over my head, and the flowers, usually well kept in neat beds, sprawled across the walkways, their tendrils reaching out like eager fingers. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my tired mind playing tricks on me. The path ahead split into two, and I chose the one less traveled, hoping for some solitude. As I ventured deeper, the air grew thicker, and the moonlight struggled to penetrate the dense foliage. The once familiar surroundings took on a sinister quality. The trees, now grotesquely twisted, formed a canopy that blocked out the sky, and the ground was carpeted with strange, pulsating plants that seemed to react to my presence. I pressed on, a growing sense of unease gnawing at my insides. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. The paths twisted and turned in impossible ways, leading me in circles. Panic set in as I quickened my pace, trying to find my way back. That's when I saw him. A tall figure stood in the distance, partially obscured by the shadowy foliage. He wore an old-fashioned gardener's outfit, a wide-brimmed hat and overalls, but his face was hidden in the darkness. Desperation overrode my fear, and I called out to him, "Hey, can you help me? I'm lost." The figure turned slowly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He moved towards me with an unnatural grace, his feet seemingly gliding over the ground. As he approached, I noticed his eyes. They glowed with an eerie green light, and his skin had a strange bark-like texture. "Welcome to my garden," he said in a voice that was both soothing and menacing. "You shouldn't be here after dark." I got lost," I stammered, backing away. "Can you show me the way out?" He smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too plant-like. "There is no way out once you've entered my labyrinth. But don't worry, you won't be leaving empty-handed." Before I could react, the plants around me came to life, their vines wrapping around my legs and arms, holding me in place. I struggled, but the more I fought, the tighter their grip became. The gardener raised his hand, and the vines lifted me off the ground, carrying me deeper into the maze. I lost track of time as I was dragged through the labyrinth. The plants whispered to each other in a language I couldn't understand, and the gardener hummed a haunting melody. Finally, we reached a clearing, illuminated by the ghostly glow of bioluminescent flowers. In the center of the clearing was a statue, or at least I thought it was a statue at first. As I was brought closer, I saw that it was a person, encased in a shell of bark and vines, their face frozen in a silent scream. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me. These were the gardener's victims, trapped forever in his twisted garden. "You will join them," the gardener said, his eyes boring into mine. "A new addition to my collection." "No!" I screamed, thrashing against the vines. "Please, let me go!" But it was no use. The vines tightened their grip, and I felt a sharp pain as they pierced my skin, their roots burrowing into my flesh. My vision blurred as a strange numbness spread through my body. The last thing I saw was the gardener's face, his smile wide and satisfied. When I awoke, I was standing in the park again, but everything was different. The plants were no longer monstrous, and the paths were clear. It was as if the labyrinth had never existed. I looked down at my hands and saw that my skin had taken on a bark-like texture. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself drawn to the park every night, compelled by an unseen force. I watched as the plants grew at an alarming rate, forming new paths and trapping unsuspecting wanderers. And each night, the gardener would choose one visitor to become a permanent part of his garden. I am one of them now, a silent guardian of the labyrinth. My body is rooted to the ground, my soul forever trapped in this twisted, nightmarish garden. If you ever find yourself in the city park after dark, beware the night gardener. You might just become his next addition. We never planned for the night to end the way it did. It started innocently enough, just a group of friends seeking a thrill, something to break the monotony of our small-town lives. We decided on an abandoned lot at the edge of town, a place whispered about in hushed tones by kids and adults alike. It was perfect for our makeshift campfire, surrounded by crumbling walls and overgrown weeds that only added to the eerie atmosphere. There were 6 of us: Jake, the fearless leader; Sarah, his girlfriend always eager for an adventure; Tom and Lisa, the inseparable twins with a knack for storytelling; Mike, the skeptic, and me, the reluctant participant dragged along for the ride. We each carried a story, an urban legend to share, hoping to outdo one another in scaring the wits out of our friends. We gathered around the fire as it crackled to life, its flickering light casting long shadows that danced on the decaying walls. Jake was the first to speak, his voice steady, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "All right, who's up first?" he asked, looking around the circle. Tom cleared his throat and began, "I've got one. It's about the Shadow Man. They say he appears on lonely streets, just a shadow at first, but if you see him, it's already too late. He follows you home, creeping closer each night, until one night, you disappear." Lisa chimed in, "Yeah, and no one ever finds a trace of you. Just gone, like you never existed." We laughed nervously, the fire crackling louder in the silence that followed. Mike rolled his eyes. "Come on, that's just a story to scare kids." But as the night wore on and more tales were told, an uneasy feeling settled over us. Sarah recounted the story of the Whispering Woman, a ghost who haunts the forest near the lot, whispering secrets that drive people mad. Jake told of the Hollow Ones, creatures that mimic the voices of loved ones to lure their victims into the dark. Each story seemed to make the shadows around us grow thicker, the air colder. It was close to midnight when I shared my tale. I had heard it from my grandmother, who swore it was true. "There's an old well in this town, hidden in the woods. They say if you peer into it at midnight, you'll see your own death reflected in the water. People who have done it, well, they don't live long after." The silence that followed was heavy, and even Mike didn't have a sarcastic remark this time. We were all on edge, the fire's warmth doing little to chase away the chill creeping into our bones. Suddenly there was a noise, a faint rustling in the overgrown bushes behind us. We all turned, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. The stories had done their job. Our imaginations were running wild. "Probably just an animal," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "Let's not freak ourselves out." But as we turned back to the fire, I noticed something odd. The shadows around the lot seemed darker, more defined, as if they were closing in. I shook off the feeling, convincing myself it was just the stories playing tricks on my mind. That's when Lisa screamed. We all jumped, hearts pounding, and turned to see her staring wide-eyed into the darkness. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A shadow. It moved." Mike scoffed, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're just seeing things, Lisa." But then Tom gasped, pointing. "There, by the old wall." We followed his gaze, and my blood ran cold. A shadow detached itself from the wall, a figure darker than the night around it. It stood there, watching us, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. "It's just a trick of the light," Jake said, but his voice wavered. The shadow moved, gliding closer. We backed away, fear tightening our throats. The stories we had told echoed in my mind, each tale more terrifying in the context of what we were witnessing. Could it be the Shadow Man, the Whispering Woman, or something worse? Without warning, the shadow lunged towards us. We scattered, screaming, the campfire flaring up as if in response to our terror. I ran, my heart hammering in my chest, my mind a whirl of panic. Behind me, I heard my friends' cries, but I didn't dare look back. I found myself at the edge of the lot, panting, my eyes darting around for any sign of my friends. The shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting and writhing. I spotted Sarah huddled behind a crumbling wall, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Sarah!" I called, rushing to her side. "Where's Jake?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, scanning the darkness. "We need to find the others." We crept through the lot, calling out for our friends, but there was no response. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of the dying fire. My mind raced, each step filled with dread. Had the stories come to life? Was this some twisted game the universe was playing on us? We found Tom next, crouched by the remains of an old shed. "I lost Lisa," he said, his voice hollow. "She was right behind me, and then she was gone." My heart sank. "We need to stick together," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "We need to find Mike and Jake." We moved as one, our eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The air seemed to grow colder, the darkness thicker. I could feel something watching us, something malevolent and hungry. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The old well, barely visible in the moonlight. A chill ran down my spine as my grandmother's story echoed in my mind. "Don't look into it," I whispered to myself, but curiosity and fear drove me closer. As we approached the well, I saw movement. Mike was there, staring into the water, his face pale and eyes wide with horror. "Mike, no!" I shouted, but it was too late. He turned to us, his expression twisted in terror. "I saw it!" he gasped. "I saw my death!" Before we could react, a shadow enveloped him, and he vanished without a sound. We screamed, stumbling back, the terror overwhelming. "Run!" Jake's voice called out from the darkness. "Get out of here!" We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, sprinting through the lot, the shadows chasing us, the air filled with our panicked cries. I could feel the darkness closing in, feel its cold breath on my neck. We burst out of the lot and into the streetlights casting a harsh, artificial light that felt like salvation. We collapsed on the pavement, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. Jake was the last to emerge, his face pale, his eyes haunted. "What the hell was that?" he panted. "I don't know," I replied, still shaking, "but we need to get out of here." We stumbled back to town, the events of the night replaying in our minds. The stories we had shared around the campfire had come to life, each one more horrifying than the last. We had lost friends, faced our deepest fears, and barely escaped with our lives. As we reached the safety of our homes, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were still watching, still waiting. The stories had come to life, and they weren't finished with us yet. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory lingered, a constant reminder of the horrors that lurk just beyond the light. And every time I pass the abandoned lot, I can still feel the eyes of the darkness, waiting for its next victims.